Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of Tactics and Practice, the series of conferences that Axioma organizes every spring at Ćosić in Ljubljana. This year's Tactics and Practice is realized in the framework of Con's platform for contemporary and investigative art, and in collaboration with the Institute of Network Culture, with which we have decided to present the 8th edition of the Money Lab. The Money Lab is an international network of artists, activists, and geeks experimenting with forms of financial democratization. And on their website, you can find all the information and documentation of previous editions, as well as a blog with valuable contributions and insights. Initially, we planned to have this event as an in real life conference that's supposed to take place in Ljubljana last March, but due to the coronavirus, obviously, this wasn't possible, and we decided therefore to reinvent it as a series of weekly streaming events to be held every Monday at 5 p.m. Central European Time on this channel. Exceptionally today, we are not streaming live due to the impossibility of coordinating the schedule of all involved guests. But we recorded just a few hours ago in this very same venue, where we invited also some special local guests to be with us in order to then participate in the final Q&A session. Next time we will certainly go live, and besides our guest in studio, we will also have a virtual chat platform for live feedbacks, comment, and questions from the online audience. So today we officially start the Money Lab 8 with a conversation between Brad Scott and Geert Lovink entitled Critical Finance Strategies 3 months into the Corona Crisis. During spring 2019, a fancy new word made the rounds in France, collapsology. What would this entail a year later? The collapse of certain aspects of global finance, logistics, and just-in-time production was announced way earlier. Still, only weeks into the Corona crisis, it is too early to say which aspect of the global financial system will be thrown into the dustbin of history. Pivotal nation-states are now exploring digital currencies as one tool for post-pandemic stimulus or austerity. How do earlier proposals for universal basic income relate to the sudden appearance of helicopter money in some countries? Are the Keynesian money proposals to prop up the Western economies an indication of the end of the neoliberal hegemony? Is the quasi ban on cash during the Corona crisis an indication of the arrival of the cashless society? These and many other issues will be touched upon by our two guests today, Brad Scott and Geert Lovink. Brad Scott is a journalist, campaigner, former derivative broker, and the author of the Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Futures of Money, that was published by Pluto back in 2013. He works on finance reform, alternative finance, and economic activism with a wide variety of NGOs, artists, students, and startups, and writes for publications such as The Guardian, New Scientist, Wired Magazine, and CNN.com. He has a new book on money and financial technology forthcoming that we are all pretty much looking forward to read. Geert Lovink is a media theorist, internet critic, and author of several referential books, the latest of which, Set by Design, was also published by Pluto, but more recently, in 2019. He is the founder of the Institute of Network Culture at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Dear Brad, dear Geert, the virtual stage is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Hey, Brad, good to see you.
You too.
I'm in Amsterdam.
Good to be back.
And you're in London.
I'm in London, yeah.
Yeah. let's start, because I cannot really envision what London looks like. It's a pretty difficult, because did the city of London, the financial hub, did it close down? Because many people have to work from their homes, I suppose.
Yeah, that's
Offices are closed. How does it look like? Have you been to the city? Did you have a look?
actually on a couple of weekends ago, I rode into the center of town on my bike, and it was pretty empty. Actually, like less empty than I expected it to be. But I actually didn't get to go to the financial sector because London's got the sort of three financial like zones in it. There's like Mayfair, there's the city, which is like they call the square mile where a lot of the big investment banks are, and then there's Canary Wharf. But I actually ended up just going around other parts of London. But I'm imagining that they're completely empty. Apparently, a lot of the traders and stuff have these. Because originally I was wondering, I was like, these guys have quite sensitive IT systems with, and I was wondering how they were going to operate from home. But apparently, they're using home Wi-Fi to do trading and stuff, and so I don't know what's going down. I think I was looking at this Adam Tooze article a little while back that came out in the Guardian, and apparently these guys were. He claims that they were using these home rigs, which have the sort of delayed Wi-Fi, which means they're really like they can't see the global markets unfolding in real time. So it's an interesting time for the financial sector for sure. But
Let's
I haven't actually. I'm sure it's completely empty in there right now.
mhm. Let's now focus on one of these big events that we have to maybe look into a bit more in detail. It was around the 25th, 27th of March that Donald Trump announced that $2 trillion bailout package. And of course, it was followed by EU, other countries with similar packages. And a lot of people say that this turns out to be, let's say, if we focus on the United States, that the Fed is kind of bailing out big companies and buying up a lot of junk bonds. And so let's just focus on this unprecedented
Sure, yeah.
measure. In fact, quite early on in the crisis, right? It happened really in the first weeks already.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the
How do you look
financial
at the?
market. I was going to say, I'm sure, traders and people in the financial markets. I mean, they're kind of paid to spend their time looking out for global risk, right? So I'm sure they were already thinking about this issue like months ago, because it would be stupid of them to not be thinking about it. So I'm sure the financial market people have been concerned about this since like December or something, or at least starting to get hints of it. And I'm sure they were like trying to figure out what to do. But yeah, as far as I understand, because I don't check the financial news day to day, so I'm not following the markets. It's too much work to do that. I mean, that's a full-time job to try and follow all the different markets and who's doing what. But as far as I understand, they all started bailing out, or started like panicking and trying to get access to US dollars. And so the US Federal Reserve and stuff had to do a ton of different activities. But strangely seems to have succeeded in at least calming things down. I think a lot of us on the streets, when you're walking around, you don't realize how big this stuff is, and the fact that you're sort of seeing this kind of calm, like relative calm. Let's say, for example, in London right now. Behind that relative calm are these gigantic state actions, where like the Federal Reserve is doing a bunch of stuff with the Bank of England, and the Bank of England is talking to all the big corporates, and they're talking to all the big banks. They're cutting deals behind closed doors. They're doing all sorts of stuff that we can't see. which then sort of like manifests in the relative calm that you see, the fact that you can still, for example, get certain things and can still, your bank account still works and so on. So I'm not really answering any question here, but I guess as a sort of meta point, it takes a while, I think. I mean, we don't really get to see a lot of what's actually been happening behind the scenes with all the big financial players, but I'm sure, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of stuff going on that which must be unprecedented, probably.
Still, I'm starting our conversation with that because the question really comes into mind: how comparable this is to the global financial crisis of 2008, and many are already rushing to answer that question and making us sure that it is indeed far worse now than it was back then. So, and this, of course, has an impact also on the things we're going to talk about later on, because a lot of the initiatives, maybe including your financial activism, the founding of Money Lab, and so many other initiatives, are all in direct or indirect response to the financial crisis of 2008. So
yeah,
I'm really interested to see, and how our initial, let's say, analysis of the current economic crisis is. In my view, there will be probably more emphasis, for instance, on unemployment, maybe less so on the collapse of banks. Maybe there will be more emphasis on the shrinking side of the economy, closing down of so many smaller, medium-sized, maybe even bigger size companies we don't know yet. So there will be more emphasis on the shrinking side, which of course initially was quite big in 2008, 9, and 10, but then after that, a lot of the emphasis was focused, for instance, on austerity, and this is still it's very, very much on my mind. And so, can you say something about your initial analysis of the first months of the corona crisis?
I can make some broad points. I mean, one thing to just note as a sort of opening statement is I've been writing a book for a year and a half, and I actually only handed it in a couple weeks ago, the first draft. And many people think that if you're writing a book that you're like super knowledgeable about everything that's been happening, but actually it's the opposite. When you're writing a book, as I'm sure you know, you spend a lot of time like focusing on your own little world for a while, and you kind of lose touch with what was going on. And as I handed the book in a few weeks ago, and then just took time off because I was like, I have to take a break. So I haven't been day to day watching actually what all the actions are. So I don't have a kind of like granular, detailed response to every single thing every central bank has to say and so on. But my sort of general impressions so far is, point one, you mentioned the US stimulus, which is, I guess, one of the big flagship US based actions that's taken place so far. That is huge. The size of that stimulus they put out, I think it's even bigger than the one that they did during the sort of 2008 financial crisis. So that immediately suggests that this is a big, serious issue for in terms of the comparative size of these. But I also think the moral dimension's very different. During the financial crisis, there's a lot of debates around, do you let the banks go to the wall? Do you, like, whose fault is this? Who's to blame for this kind of stuff? Whereas in a weird way, like, nobody really feels like anybody's to blame per se for this crisis. So actually some of the politics seems probably different in terms of like, in a way, everybody seems to agree that the state should do something right now, or different states should do something right now, which you don't find as much of that debate. I mean, people don't disagree with that point. What the real disagreements around are who gets the support, where the relative support ends up being, and you're right. There's going to be like different sort of emphasis. The obviously like very particular industries are being literally obliterated right now. I mean, particularly the airline industry, the entertainment industry, the restaurant industries, all these kind of like things that are front facing, the events industry to some extent and so on. So there's going to be particular interventions there, but then that's going to obviously feed back into all those unemployed people, like suddenly like massive spikes in unemployment. I think the US has seen like huge spikes in unemployment. So that's going to then have a broader effect on the overall economy, because suddenly all these people can't buy goods, which mean all the other industries suddenly suffer. So there's like a bunch of these things happening. And I think the other big difference with this one is the developing world, so the poorer world. And during the financial crisis, all the focus was on, like the big financial economies, the big, America and Europe and so on. But this one, I mean, my home country, South Africa, that's where I'm from. My family's from Zimbabwe, and I was born in South Africa. I mean, these countries which during the financial crisis weren't major players, they were just sort of like tangentially affected through the global markets. But this is like direct effects on poorer economies. And I think that's going to be a much bigger issue. So all the stuff around indebtedness and so on will be a different dynamic. So right now, as far as I understand, the immediate actions that have taken place have been to stabilize the core of the global financial economy. So the Federal Reserve stabilizing the US banking sector. So that's the sort of initial intervention. So in a way, that's been kind of semi-held together right now. But the rest of the world, like the poorer world, nobody's like done anything really to sort of address that issue.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was quite a long answer.
Yeah, that's okay. Because the stuff we're talking about here, about our demands, our dreams, wishes, utopias, our alternative models, they're up to a large extent also driven and responding to the current situation. So that's why I'm really keen to work on this kind of critical analysis, and because the alternatives will sprout out of that in our experience, right? They don't work in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, for instance, is a big concern of me. Will we see a mass return, to the years of extreme austerity? That's one. And because, if there is a shrinking economy, and as you say, this will be happening on a global scale, right? The lockdown effect on developing countries is maybe even worse than elsewhere. And the other one is, this thesis I put out there in the introduction, which is the question of state intervention that you already mentioned. And can we see this as a new form of, let's say, Keynesian or post-Keynesian intervention, but how does that relate to all the neoliberal dogmas that especially the politicians, but also the financial class is still subscribed to? And this is a very, very weird mix, if you like.
Yeah.
Maybe we should try to find a new term for that, because obviously the Keynesian models are not in place, even though, you know, there are interesting things happening. There is the helicopter money that we often joked about, or, you know, we talked about. Yes, in some
Yeah.
countries, people just got money and they were very surprised. How do you see it?
Yeah. Well, I think we're in a very ideological topsy-turvy state. A lot of kind of yeah, I mean, I guess topsy-turvy is the word I would use. It's sort of like this weird mix and amalgamation of ideas that previously wouldn't have been seen alongside each other. For one, I mean, even in the UK here, you have, you know, a Tory government who suddenly is like all rah-rah about the NHS, the public health system. You know, like that would have been, for a lot of Tories, that's like, you know, would never happen before. But suddenly now public health is like, you know, state-funded public health is a big, way back, back on the agenda. And this is like an issue that's been going on for a long time in the UK, the battle between those who wish to sort of privatize stuff. And suddenly that is the sort of public are very pro the public health system right now in the UK. And so that's like, you know, one change. And more generally, the sort of like, I guess what you would call the sort of neoliberal dogma, when I'm like of where markets or states basically act to facilitate markets to do everything, or to, as the sort of response to every social ill or every kind of thing in society. I mean, that's like really being destabilized right now, because I think everybody basically understands that the markets essentially just collapse without state support right now. So yeah, I mean, I think we're in a sort of zone which we probably don't have language for right now, because the traditional sort of state versus market kind of thinking. I mean, that thinking is already tired. That thinking's been tired for a long time, but it still seems to like get dragged out all the time, right? But I think it's going to be particularly under stress right now. The other thing, I mean, you're talking about sort of like Keynesian, which I guess can mean in various things, but like essentially sort of the state intervening to boost up demand in various ways. You know,
the anti-cyclical, let's say, intervention.
Okay.
You know, that
So
many of us was hoping for 10 years ago, which didn't happen. You know, they choose
so
to
the government
really
goes in and
devastate the
takes.
economy.
Yeah, I mean, right now, of course, we're looking at like the market. I mean, whenever I'm thinking about market systems, I always imagine these sort of giant networks, right? These kind of like nodes that are all connected together by, like, imagine this giant network mesh. And then I imagine like there are smaller and bigger nodes, like corporations are much bigger than like little nodes, but you have this gigantic, you know, interconnected mesh. And it's kind of like, you know, as an ordinary person, you experience yourself as this tiny little player in this huge interconnected system, and you can't really see it, but you have to go to get a job and you got to do all these things, right? And if you stop doing that, you get thrown off the side, right? Like it's like a treadmill. If you stop moving, it dumps you on the ground. And this is the feeling that lots of people who are precarious in society have, right? You're part of this gigantic system. But yeah, when that system stops all of a sudden, or at least whole sections of it stop, it goes into shock. I mean, essentially, this is what they call recessions. You know, like the system starts to judder and like fall apart if you stop it. And right now with the lockdown, essentially what you've had is like an order to like half of the private sector, just saying you just got to basically, I mean, I'm not sure what percentage of the working population is affected, but let's say a significant percentage has been told, like, don't go and do stuff, which means it's being forced into shock. So then the question comes in, the state in order to keep that system going, must take the place of the private sector, who ordinarily would have been buying stuff and ordinarily would have been keeping each other going. It's got to go and buy stuff, and so that's all the Keynesian stimulus stuff is like this huge entity. The state must go and buy things from to give people money in order to keep the system going. And so the US stimulus and all the stuff is about that. And I guess the politics of that really becomes like, who does the state choose to target these types of stimuluses at? So like when they're writing out checks from the US to people for like $1,200, that's the kind of helicopter money that's happened in the US there. That's them targeting the small parts of the system, but they'll also be like, buying up corporate debt of companies that are about to go bust so that to keep them going, so that they don't fire everybody and so on. So like the state's going to do a whole bunch of different actions, different actions to keep things going. But I guess just to like finish this off, like so in some ways these like Keynesian policies are progressive, but then there's also been combined with a bunch of like strange, there's all these surveillance elements that are coming in at the same time, and there's like a bunch of cronyism that can happen, with this as well. So there's a whole bunch of like weird sort of right-wing elements at the same time as, progressive elements. And I think that's what we're still trying to figure out, is which countries are going to take this in a progressive route and which are going to take it into a conservative kind of like repressive route.
Okay, let's now turn to the book and the topic that you've been working on. Remember, I want to go back to Money Lab 3, I think it was in 16. You were there as well, here in Amsterdam, and the government in India, Modi, had taken out a whole lot of banknotes. And this is when, for me at least, we, for the first time within the Money Lab context, really started to discuss, let's say, cashless society and this whole topic. And I've, in many instances, had to think of you and the work you've been doing and the things that you are covering in your book. Do you feel that the things you've been writing on that we've been discussing in the last 3 or 4 years is now kind of realizing, on a much, much larger scale, because people are afraid to touch these dirty banknotes? Or how do you look at that?
Mm-hmm.
And can you say something?
Yeah,
it's
quite a. I'd say it's a curveball. In some ways, but like what I've been writing about in terms of cash, which has been some work I've been doing over the last few years on quote unquote the cashless society, which I don't call the cashless society. I refer to it as the bankful society. All right, because what a cashless society is basically a monetary system dominated by the banking sector. Okay, and that's like the big point is that so-called cashlessness is basically banks. So that's what you have. But like, and one of my main points that I've been making for like years now about this is that it's not an organic process that occurs from the bottom up, which is how it's often presented. It's just like, somehow the sort of change has happened. It's been a process that's been actively pushed for a long time by the banking sector, the payments industry, the financial technology industry, and states. I mean, as you say, the Modi government in India like overtly try to destroy half the cash system. I mean, like this is like well known that there are large actors who wish for the disappearance of cash. This is like, and then the story gets told that actually, it's ordinary people who really want this to happen. Okay. And there's these two types of stories like kind of feed on each other, or they kind of like intersect with each other. So there's a whole bunch of dynamics. And I do a lot of analysis on how that process works. But of course, and actually prior to Corona, the digital payments industry has always said stuff around cash being unhygienic and a sort of vector for disease and so on.
That's
right?
an older story.
Yeah, it's an older story for sure, and it's not illegitimate actually. It's not like it's not. I mean, most people who are in developing countries, for example, where there's, for example, like tuberculosis and stuff like that, it's known that that if you're interacting with the physical environment, regardless of whether it's like with cash or with, passing around beers or sharing cigarettes, whatever it is, anything that involves physical interaction in an environment that has infectious disease, you're aware of it if you're in a country that's where that's prevalent.
Yeah.
All right, so that's
You need
not
to
like
wash your
new for
hands
people.
more often, obviously,
Yeah, exactly, right. And this is not like news to people who are like involved and being in environments that are like this, right? So actually, this whole the sort of story about this like scaremongering around like cash being like dirty, it's like, well, let me tell you something else. Like, physicality is dirty. Like human beings, we are dirty. When you're making out with somebody at a nightclub, you're dirty, right? Like, if you go on your Tinder date and you're like holding hands, you're dirty. Like, if you're like at a karaoke evening sharing a microphone and having fun, like, you're passing stuff around. Like, this is like a basic fact of biological life in communal human society. Okay, so like, this is nothing new. And I guess what's happening right now is we are seeing a retreat to the digital in a lot of facets of life right now, beyond the monetary system. You're seeing a retreat to the digital with all forms of physical interaction, right? People are doing meetings online now. They're doing all this stuff everywhere. And actually, it's an interesting question. And of course, like the digital payments industry right now is presenting itself. They're taking advantage of this opportunity to be like, well, Mark, we're here to save you from that disgusting physical world. Exactly. So of course, yes, the cash is currently being demonized even more than it has been in the past. This is, a big win in terms of like a propaganda tool for the digital payments industry. But on the other hand, actually, people right now are being forced to ask themselves, do we like living in the digital world? One thing that I'm seeing people suddenly saying is like, oh, geez, I wish I could go outside. I wish I could go to a party. I wish I could do something. So actually, there's a strange, like, the initial reaction is to be like, reject the physical world, reject the disgusting, unhygienic stuff, the door handles, all these things. But then the like subsequent reaction that emerges after a little while is like, I actually miss all that sort of interaction. So this is a long way to like say, I don't actually quite yet know the psychological impact it's going to have in terms of people's perceptions of cash, and actually the physical world more generally. But certainly what I can tell you is it's going to be used as a new tool to try and destroy the cash system even further.
Could you maybe, as a sneak preview, take us through your upcoming book and say what the different chapters deal with, but just very curious. So.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you know, when you've been writing a book, you kind of like, you've been in it for so long that you kind of like, it seems like you should know what it's about, but it's like you sort of don't know where to start. But let me try to do a kind of the book is essentially looking at the automation of global finance as part of a broader process of the automation of corporate capitalism more generally, right? So, and within that, the war on cash is one part of it, right? Because to automate the global financial system, you need to digitize the money supply. You can't, like, cash essentially stands in the way of large-scale automation. This is why, for example, Amazon, the US last year, various cities in the US, like Philadelphia, like various cities, passed laws saying shops had to accept cash for financial inclusion reasons, because people don't have bank accounts and they'd be excluded by the fact that you couldn't use cash. And one of the biggest sort of lobbyists against this wasn't the banks, it was Amazon. All right, because Amazon hates things that aren't automated, right? It wants everything remotely, it wants like sort of giant data centers interacting with each other. It wants like its own data center to interact with Visa's data center or MasterCard's data center and the bank's data centers. They don't want you there like saying, you know, can you give me change for my note, right? They want seamless, like integrated global automation. So of course the cash system is completely counter to everything that's large scale automated platform corporations want, right? And they sort of like grudgingly have to use it sometimes. Like when, you know, if you're in Kenya, for example, Uber drivers will take cash and stuff because, you know, and Uber sort of reluctantly allows this because it's like, well, if we want to operate in this environment, we still have to use this stuff, right? But like if Uber had an opportunity to destroy the Kenyan cash system and replace it with, you know, MasterCard transfers from bank accounts, it would do it straight away. So this is a big unknown element that people don't really talk about with this debate around the digitization of the money supply. So the book sort of starts by looking at the sort of the more specific issues around the war on cash, like the sort of surveillance elements, the financial inclusion elements, the dynamics, the difference between the state money system and the bank money system, because the banks control the digital money system. And then it looks at the sort of broader financial automation. And then it kind of ends off into, it goes into cryptocurrency as well. I do whole sections on, there's a whole like section on the crypto response to that, and then like the failure of it, and then it kind of like, it looks into the future with sort of these new things like state digital currency. And this is a very broad brush overview, but it,
sure.
Yeah.
I thought that it gives an idea, but yeah, I seem to remember, you know, when we started Money Lab in 2013, we talked about, for instance, crowdfunding, things like that, and then suddenly, a few years later, we started to realize that this big debate on universal basic income, which is now, you know, kind of the helicopter money is a very weird version of that. And then relation between the cashless society and surveillance and automation. They came to the agenda, and that in itself I find very interesting, because now we seem to be living in a period, at least, you know, in which these two are really becoming apparent, not just to us, but to billions of people, and then which tells us a bit, maybe a little bit, that we, well, on the one hand, we can be proud that we, you know, and understood one or two things early on, but also that we have a responsibility there, that what we are thinking of, discussing, speculating, designing, you know, is something that is not happening in a vacuum. That our activism, our art projects, our funky and sometimes very marginal debates are in fact at you know, at the center stage without us realizing. How do you look at that?
Yeah, Money Lab has often been ahead of the curve and lots of stuff. So it's, and if you think about Money Lab being a zone where kind of slightly esoteric and, you know, types of slightly outsider type people come along, I mean, these are people who are often feeling out the edges of new things, right? And sometimes if you're out in the frontiers, like sort of searching for stuff, you often like, you find something new and you think it's kind of really cool, but then you like sort of later, it turns out you discover that actually it's a lot darker than it seems. So I remember like some of the early Money Labs, people would be like, oh, you know, cryptocurrency, for example, like, oh, this is interesting. We should, so like, yeah, it was way ahead way ahead of the curve, but then all the sort of like crap comes out later when you suddenly realize the sort of conservative underpinnings and all the kind of like, and so I think that's been interesting with Money Lab, is seeing how, you only kind of like get the true political meaning of a lot of the stuff, later when it gets incorporated into the mainstream. But certainly,
can you tell us maybe where we are in that sense? I know that you are, for instance, you critique this idea of the cryptocurrency, and you emphasize much more the role or the potential of tokens.
I mean, this is a huge. I mean, I've been a critic of the crypto world for a while. I mean, that's. I mean, I was an early user of Bitcoin. I was in the early sort of London Bitcoin community. But kind of, I mean, yeah. I mean, the long and the short of that, because I don't really want to derail us into the territory of talking too much about it. I think Bitcoin gets too much press anyway. Like it takes up too much energy in the public debate, and actually in the world's like energy, like literal energy system. But crypto in many ways has largely failed. At least the original cryptocurrency movement has largely failed to do any of the sort of things that it claimed it would do. Liberate people from banks and so on. And it kind of like always was somewhat unrealistic, but largely because the sort of monetary design is so crude. So the sort of cryptocurrency world, at least the first wave of it, just essentially specialized in creating systems that would enable people to issue these kind of like these sort of blank tokens to each other and then move them around. And that's pretty much it. And that's cool. It's like, okay, fine, I can move a sort of strange digital object around, but I can't tell you what this digital object is, other than it takes a certain amount of effort to get it, to bring it to life. And that's pretty much what cryptocurrency is, and that's where it stayed. That's kind of it.
Do you, do you acknowledge that it has some value? Or
of course, yeah.
Do you use the word value?
I've historically used cryptocurrencies and stuff, so like I don't think they're illegitimate as sort of, they're like technologically fascinating, but as a sort of monetary instrument, they got like huge flaws. And this is, I mean, to some extent, this is because I come from a very different sort of monetary theory background to most of the people in the cryptocurrency world. Many people in the cryptocurrency world come from sort of conservative libertarian economics, which has a very sort of strange view on what money is. It kind of views it as being a kind of like object-like commodity. Whereas I come from sort of credit theories of money and stuff, which sees money as essentially systems of IOUs or promises, or an accounting system. And so these are often incompatible views. And actually, some of the most interesting projects that I get excited about are where you see the cryptocurrency infrastructure, so blockchain technology, being hybridized with credit money monetary design. And to put this in sort of straightforward terms, mutual credit systems, for example, like Sardex in Sardinia, is a very good example of a very good mutual credit system, which is like very sound monetary design principles. Something like that hybridized with a decentralized technological architecture becomes very interesting. And like that's the kind of stuff that I find fascinating. But like the sort of straightforward crypto is kind of boring to me, because it doesn't really have any chance of actually ever displacing, the normal monetary system. But I mean, just to go back to the current debate, it's really interesting that actually I haven't really seen the crypto world right now respond much to this. And actually, I put this tweet out like a month or so ago, where I was sort of saying about the different types of responses that we all have to a crisis, and I have all three of these responses in me when I experience a crisis. And there's like the statist response, right? Which is like, I am part of a nation. I hope that the authorities will do something that, act in my behalf and, to, help. So like the sort of statist response, the state thing is like, you hope that your leaders will serve you. All right. And you want to follow. And then there's like the libertarian response, which is like, screw that. I'm going off by myself. I'm going to go hoard stuff from the grocery store. I'm going to go and like hide myself in a bunker, like, back away from me, stay away. Like I'm my own
Which
thing,
they
right?
do, probably,
Yeah,
I
literally, right?
suspect,
And then there's the communitarian anarchist response, which is we're not going to rely on the state. We're going to like form community support networks of solidarity and form these like close meshes and help each other. So that's all the mutual aid networks. And when you think about the monetary responses right now, you actually find examples of all of this type of stuff. So for all the big news money stuff, it's the statist stuff. It's like the central bank is going to, the US Federal Reserve is going to flood the market. It's going to buy up all the sort of bonds to just keep the financial sector going and so on. This is the sort of big scale response. But then there's the crypto world who like, retreat to cyberspace so we can like pass these weird like tokens around in the hope that this like somehow saves us, which really doesn't have anything much to offer right now. But then the most interesting stuff has actually been the communitarian anarchist responses, which is more like we will form these networks. And this is what Money Lab has often been, the ethos has often been more in that sort of zone, right? And mutual credit systems, which is a form of alternative currency, is the counterpart to communitarian anarchist thinking. So like looking ahead beyond the immediate sort of crisis reaction, which is more state-based, I think that's where some of the most interesting monetary experimentation can happen going forward. But that's going to be like more like a post, something that's still going to emerge in time, because it doesn't, right now the response is very state-based. We can talk about the UBI and stuff as well if you want. I mean, that's a whole
no. But I'm more interested to spend, let's say, the last part of our dialogue here on possible strategies, on artistic responses, where we see our wild and very diverse community of designers and programmers, activists, researchers are going to maybe in the post COVID period, which I think in my first analysis will be a very weird mix still between post-Keynesian intervention, austerity, but also a shrinking economy, a huge unemployment, and social unrest. So this is what's ahead of us, and where in that overall picture, should we position the experiments with the democratization of money or new forms, alternative forms of digital money. This is what concerns me, and maybe as a German, very Marxian friend says, aren't we overemphasizing here the role of money, and why don't we focus more on the bigger economic picture? Why do we stick to money? Bread? Why money?
Well, we don't have to. I mean, money is it's not separate from anything else. It's I mean, earlier on I had this vision where I say, when I think about a market economy, I think about this sort of giant interconnected network with different sized nodes. But what holds those networks together is the monetary system. So money is always implied in every economic situation. So and you either focus attention on it or you don't, but it's always there, right, as a thing, right? So it's and although I'm aware that, like, if you hang around post-Keynesians versus Marxists, and the Marxist community sort of crosses over, or like sometimes overlaps with the post-Keynesian community, but like not always. There is a sort of like zone of in the middle, which is often very interesting. But often like Marxists, they kind of shy away from thinking about the financial sector, or kind of like sort of skirt over it, or don't really like engage. Whereas the post-Keynesians, like that's their entire thing. It's like, the financial system. Post-Keynesians are way better on monetary stuff than Marxists are, de facto for sure. Like I have no problem about saying that. And actually, there's a bunch of us who really like the idea of like, hybridizing post-Keynesian. And I'm sorry if people don't understand post-Keynesian stuff, but basically like it's sort of progressive monetary theory ideas, hybridizing it with the sort of insights of Marxism. But so that's going to be an interesting thing going forward, is potentially that hybridization of some critical political economy traditions. But yeah, we don't have to focus on the monetary system all the time. It's like a lens that you can see stuff through. So for example, as I was saying, mutual aid networks is right now, I helped start up a mutual aid network when I was in Berlin. I was at the beginning of this crisis, I was in Berlin. We set one up there. But I set it up with a couple of friends of mine, Sarah Friend and Julio Linares, who work on this thing called Circles, which is a mutual credit, like kind of like a basic income. Well, it's a mutual credit type currency, all right. But like their impulse as practitioners of a mutual credit style of currency was to set up mutual aid networks. So these things, these types of different interventions sort of like harmonize with each other. But the things I've been seeing on the ground here in London, like the rent strikes. So like one of the big areas going forward is going to be rights for renters.
That's going to be huge.
Like huge backlash against the landlords. People are like suddenly like, what do you even do, landlords? Like we're like the ones who like the root of the productive economy. You're just sitting here demanding money from us in the midst of a crisis, but you don't actually do anything. All right. So like I think it's gonna be a big revival of kind of these ideas of like screw the landlords, which you find like in classical political economy from like the 18th century and stuff. Like this has been going on for a long time. So I think that's going to be a big area. A lot of the stuff around, which is exciting, potentially around workers' rights, people suddenly being aware of like, shit, these like Amazon workers get really like, how the stuff that they have to go through.
For
sure. And then on the monetary stuff, the big ones, people thinking about basic income as and that's a whole topic in itself because there's different versions of that and so on. But I think there are like in those intersections between those different areas would be some of the most interesting areas for us to explore. I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Let's go into that, because this would be the future agenda also of Money Lab. I think that's where we're heading. I agree with you. I think we should close that chapter of the cryptocurrency, but take from it maybe certain aspects of, for instance, distributed or federated form of administration
for sure.
and accounting. I think that's a good thing, and also maybe the wild and the speculative energy that is
sure.
or was out there, which I love, and we need that. We need that for sure.
Yeah.
Because
no, I totally agree with you. Actually, some of the most
we're
interesting.
Only complaining.
In the early days of cryptocurrency, you had incredible creative energy, which then became quite toxic after a while, and actually it then moved. So I don't think the creative energy is actually in the sort of traditional cryptocurrency community anymore. It's actually moved to the outskirts again, like to these sort of like people who are taking elements of it, as you say, and who are using it now in new types of ways. And I think that's going to be where we have to sort of search for. And maybe could I just sort of say something on the UBI debate as a way to just, because I know.
Yeah, we'll have to wrap it up because we're. Yeah, okay. Just close it off, and then we go to the questions of the audience we have out there in Ljubljana.
Okay, well, just the one thing is, there's going to be a mainstream debate on UBI, and there's going to be sometimes it's going to be actually sort of like monetary policy interventions disguised as UBI, and so there's like I just put out a warning to people when they're sort of engaging with these debates. Often this name is a very sort of like slippery term, and it kind of gets like co-opted in various ways. But also bear in mind, like in the alternative currency community, people who are trying to bypass the traditional banking sector, sometimes there is an aspiration to do UBI within the alternative currency world. And one of the things I would sort of caution about is that to do basic income, you really need to establish a currency first. So I've seen quite a lot of these alternative currency projects who are sort of saying, we will be an alternative currency that starts as a UBI. But actually, like UBI, the idea is like you establish a monetary network that people are dependent upon. And then within that, you start to do interventions and move it around. So I think there's a lot of interesting experimentation that can be done there, but it's like definitely a work in progress.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Let's welcome the people in the audience out there. Yeah, there you are. How are you?
My name is Iztok, and actually I was a journalist for the past 10 years, covering mostly economic, technology, and business topics. And my first question would actually go in the beginning of your discussion. You were mentioning helicopter money. But if we are honest, we had helicopter money effect in Europe and USA for the last decade. I mean, the yields on the German bonds are negative since 2014. And if we look at the situation, actually what changed in the Corona time is that more people are now getting this free money, which has been really cheap or free for some years now. And on the other side, I would like to quote Milton Friedman, if you don't mind. For the most of his life, when he was asked what any country should do to help its economy, he said three things: privatize, privatize, privatize. But in the last 10 years of his life, and he saw what his Chicago boys did in South America, he actually changed his answer to three things: rule of law, rule of law, and rule of law. And my question actually is, at the moment, we are seeing a lot of money going from the government, from the taxpayers, into different fields. As I said before, it was happening before. But just for what is changing now, I don't know if you saw when Trump actually said that he's going to give $2 trillion to the US economy. I think Bloomberg had an article about this, and the title was "Fed, we are going to buy the whole world." And if you look at what actually now the American government and other governments are doing, they're buying assets that they were not buying before, like the things that actually got us in problem in 2008. And sorry for a long intro, my question is, why are not we discussing the role of rule of law in these times? Because I think that what we learned from the previous crisis, without it, I mean, if the rules are not the same for everybody else, it's stupid to change the rules at all, isn't it? Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it for both of us or for?
I think it's for both of you. I mean,
yeah. Let me just very briefly say that I agree with you, but we need a lot of kind of expertise there. Financial expertise, investigative journalism to really understand it. To come up with a lot of evidence and then translate it, popularize it if you want, so that many more people will understand what's going on here. So to unpack everything you said, already takes a lot of time, and then to translate that, let's say, into a popular, politics. Will take some time, and this is the problem of this response. And we could say, okay, are we slow to respond? But indeed, it will take time for us to understand it, and maybe also to understand, and invent maybe a new language For instance, the whole impact of negative interest rates, this very weird incident that happened with the negative oil price, and so on and so on, right? This, in my view, requires an independent force that is out there, which can do the work. Which in Netherlands, for instance, here we have a group like, let's say, Follow the Money. There are other kind of more interventionist. We can think of the way the journalists responded in the Panama Papers coalition, stuff like that. I would like to see that happening.
Just maybe to add, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but one thing to, of course, to bear in mind right now is that the rules get changed straight away in the midst of a crisis. They're not paying attention to any rules. I think they've changed ECB rules, and they've randomly made alterations to stuff that was previously seen as unassailable. And states will always partly justify this as crisis measures, but what we should be thinking about all those types of interventions right now are they're essentially trying to save a problematic system, right? They're designed to prop up a deeply problematic and frequently toxic financial system, and that's what it's always been designed to do, a lot of these sort of policies. And the interesting thing during a crisis, of course, is that people on the one hand have a deeply conservative impulse, which is we want things to go back to normal. And we want our leaders to do stuff which will make it go back to normal. And if that means the Fed's going to go and buy up, junk bonds from, American corporates to keep them going so that they can then pay their global suppliers, so that their governments in those countries will then, there's all these sort of chain reactions. And the Fed essentially is the most important player in the global system right now. People will accept it because they kind of have this conservative impulse, which is let's keep the system going and we'll think about the consequences later. Ironically, one of the people who are most screwed over in the global economy are also the ones who are the most screwed over when a crisis hits. They're the first to get hit in the midst of a crisis, and they are often actually are people who want for the system to kind of come back online, they kind of want to be exploited again, in a sense. So that's a very strange thing to say, but the people who have the least monetary buffer, who have the least savings in their accounts, the one who have the worst working conditions, the most precarious people are the ones who often have the conservative impulse to get their jobs back. So you find this very dangerous thing that starts happening in the situations where you can find right-wing populism and so on that comes out of the scenario, because you can play on that fear. And I guess, so this is kind of a long way of saying, right now, politicians can get away with a whole bunch of stuff because people are scared. And I think going forward, what the big fight is can you bring light to this? Can we sort of help people on the bottom of the economy who are the most scared right now often, but without lapsing into this kind of unaccountable sort of crony politics? I'm sorry, that's a very long answer, but that's our big challenge.
Can I have another question?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I would I also spent 1 year in the crypto ecosystem. And actually, I have one question. If you actually, from your book, in 2018, I had the pleasure of attending a close conference where most of the financial ministers from the European Union, state members, and all the regulators were present, and there was a really honest discussion. And they all said they don't expect that cash will go out of the system, not in the near future. And their biggest argument was security. They were claiming that they cannot make not even the crypto ecosystem secure enough that they would actually be able to put the cash out of the system.
Yeah.
So do you agree with that, or was that just a bit of political statement?
No, sure. It depends on what part of the government you're speaking to. If you're speaking to taxation authorities, they very much want cash to disappear. But if you're speaking to central bankers, they often have a slightly different take on it. Partly because they realize the financial stability implications of getting rid of cash. They recognize that, well, one, that the banking sector, when there's instability in the banking sector, people want to get out of the banking sector. And how do they get out? Well, they go and get state money from the ATM. That's what they do. That's how you escape or exit the banking system. And if you cannot exit the banking system, then you have some potentially really big issues. So, very simple thing to think about. The U.S. Federal Reserve, when there's a hurricane approaching the U.S., they report 500% increase in demand for cash in the areas that the hurricane's approaching. It's pretty simple. Like the digital money system's not reliable. Like when the electricity goes down. So, but one of the debates you're going to see happening right now is about state or central bank digital currency, CBDC. It's like one of the kind of current buzzwords, and that's basically states saying, okay, can we create this digital version of cash so we can kind of enable financial inclusion while sort of phasing out the physical cash system. And there's huge politics around this CBDC, because if states do begin issuing their own publicly accessible digital currency, it could have severe implications for the banking sector's stability. This is quite a technical topic we can go into, but this is a hot topic right now in sort of monetary politics, as it were. But you're right, it's not obvious that cash will disappear, even if there's lots of parties who are trying to make it disappear.
Thank you very much.
Hi, first of all, thank you for this very inspiring debate. My name is Tjaša Pureber. I am a cultural worker, a political scientist with anarchist background. I have a short comment and then I hope a question that you will both respond to. It seems to me that before this whole corona crisis started to happen, what we were seeing on a global scale was the preservation of an illusion that the welfare state system, as we know it in the Western world, can still somehow exist. What we saw was an obvious destruction of this system for many decades. On one hand, and on the other, an attempt of, for instance, Trump to redefine what whiteness means, what the included small gated society can actually mean, in which we can still preserve this illusion that we can have a welfare state, that we can have a functioning system, obviously on the expense of people being excluded. And so now when we entered the corona crisis, what we saw was the huge population that are being excluded, even from the bailouts, even from even more obviously from the welfare system. Those who are most precarious were actually not entitled to the helicopter money. So in a way, it seems to me that stay at home was actually, as a hashtag, was actually a very class based concept that only worked for people who could actually afford it, for new form of what a gated community, that can still benefit from the state and from financial system is. So it seems to me that in a way, the way that the whole crisis is playing out is we are hearing words that were in a way used, during the Nazi era about essential workers, about non-essential workers. We are seeing a sort of war on the poor, on those people who are expendable in every crisis, and those are the people who have not been staying at home, who have been working in industries without proper protection and so on and so forth, all the time, while some smaller proportions of society were actually able to be safe. So in connection with the war on cash, and I'm coming sort of to my question, it seems to me that if the war on cash is actually the war on poor, similarly as, you know, Corona crisis is in a way, or like the measurement of the state is the war on the poor. It seems to me that a cashless society obviously means, as Brett, you have been saying, it is actually really pushing out all the illegalized people, all the poor people, all the communities, for instance, squatting communities, you know, all the people who are forced to live in sort of like, I don't like to use the word criminal, but let's say alternative forms of economies, you know, because other classical jobs are not available to them. So all the people who are already living on the edges of society, it seems to me that will only come out on the losing side after this crisis. So that being said, and in combination with complete control of the state and of corporations that are being imposed both during Corona crisis and, you know, during this war on cash phase, it seems to me that we are entering a very interesting times, obviously, that are perhaps already here. So my what I would like to hear from you is perhaps a little bit more about how you see this connection between war on cash to war on poor and to the increase of control over the, let's say, unwanted populations. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean the in the mainstream debate, in sort of standard policy forums and stuff, war on cash, ironically, is framed as in terms of financial inclusion. So they have this whole thing at like, oh, you know, poorer people suffer because they have to use cash all the time. And therefore, by absorbing them into the banking system, we are helping the poor. This is the sort of the standard line. And there's a debate about whether that's, you know, how to do that. Of course, the massive power thing that's completely glossed over is historically the banking sector has preyed upon poorer people and frequently not stood for their interests. Historically, in most societies, the banking sector represents economic elites. So, for example, in my home country of South Africa, the banking sector originally represented white capitalists and would not serve black people in the country. You know, and so then in sort of like subsequent years, the idea that like if you're a poor marginalized person, that you should naturally desire to be absorbed into the mainstream banking sector is a very problematic statement, right? And it's become completely mainstream, this idea that everyone should obviously wish to be absorbed into the giant mega corporations of global finance. This is what they call financial inclusion. But if you like, you know, look into this, actually cash historically has often provided a form of protection for those who are screwed over by the institutions, or the sort of mainstream institutions. And this is why, you know, actually cash is often associated with criminality, is precisely the fact that people who are most pushed into being forced into criminal behaviors are often those who are the most marginalized and who have no other options, right? So this is your people on the edge of society. This is what your options are. So like there's a natural correlation between precarity and inequality and forms of criminality. And of course, this whole like attempt to sort of demonize cash as being the zone of the criminal is like, yeah, it's a war on the poor. That's another way of putting it, right? And yes, it's true, sort of gangsters who grew up on the wrong side of town and who happen to become like kingpins in their era do also happen to use cash, and you can use that to demonize cash. So like, yes, absolutely, this is part of a much broader kind of sort of attempt to absorb the sort of peripheries of the global economy into the sort of centers of power. But just you know, broadly on your sort of your point about this is right now absolutely like linked into the sort of, we're seeing these sort of reactionary with these processes occurring, many other things. So like right now the players that are getting the biggest support from the state are often like big corporates, right? Like because they're too big to fail. So states are going to focus all their attention on supporting the biggest players and make sure that they're fine. And then all the smaller players will be allowed to often go to the wall. And this will enable the consolidation of power in these big players, because they're going to have excess surplus money to be able to, say, buy up their old competitors and so on. So this is one of the big sort of dangerous things we could see going forward, is a sort of increased consolidation more generally of sort of smaller, more peripheral players into the center. That's kind of a long way of saying this. Geert, do you want to add anything?
No, let's move to the next question, because we have two more. So
Okay.
let's see.
Hello.
Hello. Hey.
My name is Vuk and I make files. Hi, Geert. I haven't seen you in 20 years, or what was it? So, yeah, I got a reaction or two, and then maybe a question if I get there, if I don't forget it by the time I finish with my comments, and there's very little of that. I've been also, like Geert, actually, we've been doing much of this together 30 or 25 years ago. I've been into these modems and moving files around for a lot of time now, since the early 90s. And I wanted to share an emotion with you because, Brett, I think you said something about everything retreating to digital and how people are now looking for other experiences and shit. But I like to look at this from another angle. And I was in a talk a couple of days ago, and somebody asked me, as an old net artist, how I feel now that apparently all art is net art, which is like an insane thing to say. And I think I gave them a useful phrase, and I think many people share this bitter disgust. And this is that, like, I feel like Johnny Rotten watching Take That, the band, in Eurosong doing a cover of Anarchy in the UK. Like, there's something wrong and very off with what's being, what passes as online art or culture nowadays. And I thought this is not a bad thing to share with you. One other little thing that, I wrote down in my telephone while I was listening to your debate is this apparent ideological cognitive dissonance where hardcore financial conservatives are now seriously handing out helicopter money as the best idea that they can have. And Geert, you might like this, and actually I can contact you later because you're the Dutch people have fun with these type of things. I'm working on a dictionary of missing expressions, and I think I have an expression that might fit this particular aroma of cognitive dissonance, and that is Breton Woodstock. Simply because I believe here you have intergenerational solidarity between the Bretton Woods generation that came up with that model and the baby boomers that are now, let's say refining it with all the cynicism possible. Okay, so these were my two tiny little remarks that I had while listening, and I wrote down. Now, as for questions, Brett, I'm sorry, I'm not so much into cash in any way. Theoretically or practically. So I would like rather to harass my dearest old friend Geert, because I saw that you published a thing together with Ben, and yes, I'm noticing you have a tendency to work with people with short names, Ben and Brett and Pitt and all that. Anyway, how, because I'm really lazy to read through all of that, and you apparently spoke to him about avant-garde creativity in this time of post-social media and Corona at the same time. Could you give us a broad brush outline so I don't have to read that much?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Now that's good, because what is important here, I would like to link it back to the question of, who's really going to be affected. And I think, yes, we can focus on the poor in general, but we also, in Western societies, we need to broaden that. We also need to apply that to our own sectors. And obviously, a sector that's going to be hit very, very hard is what a couple of years ago was known as the sharing economy. Um, all the temp workers, the precarious workers, which of course a lot of them are actually working in the sector, that I'm and you, Vuk, are kind of close to the sector of the arts, design, programming, right? People who work, on short contracts, who have a gig here and there, um, who align themselves to a larger institution, and then a little later find themselves that they're no longer in favored. And I think one of the big problems that we will see is when the economy is shrinking over a longer period of time, that it is this group that is going to be hit hard. And this is already the case, right? And this was already happening. We could even say this was happening before Corona, but every kind of surplus money that was there was somehow, circulating, and those on short-term contracts were able to get some out of it. When that's no longer circulating, they're out. And so, and what we then should do is we can go and take the analysis in two directions. One is one of the let's say the aesthetics of it. So the question there is then, what is the role of arts and visual culture in this, when there's virtually no money to be made in that arena anymore. The other direction we could take is one of organization. Are these people going to revolt? And we know that their situation is quite difficult, and we know that traditionally they're quite hesitant to organize themselves. Obviously, the whole concept of trade union doesn't make much sense there, right? I mean, people have tried that already. If you look at Uber workers, there's already some experience with that. So, and then we should, kind of in a Hegelian turn almost, look at this also as a potential. Okay, where is the revolutionary potential here? Or maybe there isn't any, right? Maybe that's very likely. Maybe the millennials and even worse hit Generation Z is just going to be out there, and it's going to flirt even more so with right-wing populist nationalist solutions. And that's my big fear. Maybe last question, because we're running out of time.
Hi there. My name is Kranjc. Here in Slovenia, I'm a researcher, translator, and educator, especially in the fields of political ecology, degrowth. I dabble in commons and other topics like decoloniality, post-humanism. I'm also an activist in the local climate justice movement, Youth for Climate Justice, which formed like early last year. I help coordinate the education there, and currently we're running a talk series in Corona times, so to say, on different, getting different takes from degrowth, commons, social ecology, ecofeminism, and other perspectives. More recently, I'm also helping coordinate peer-to-peer foundation research. I'm co-authoring an interesting paper these days with some interesting folks from the DLT space, like grassroots economics, economic space agency, Commons Stack, Commons Engine, Yeah, in that paper, we're dabbling kind of with the question of scaling or federating, like this multi-tier scaling and conceptualizing transformation through the affordances of TLTs. And one of my passions is designing games and co-designing games, which kind of combine areas of alternatives to development, let's say shorthand, participatory futures methods, and theories of transformation from different sorts, from socio-technical to more, aesthetic and experiential ways of doing change. So I propose I would outline very short, like a kind of future scenario, and I would ask you both to kind of maybe poke holes in it or maybe complement it with some of your ideas. But essentially, I want to lean back on what you mentioned about the like re-embeddedness of the role of the state, or the role of the state kind of being more out there in these times, and the reinvigoration, so to say, of the UBI debate in combination with ecological currencies and participatory economics, or participatory approaches to building economies. So one of the core concepts that I want to lean in this scenario is a small word with big implications, of course, commodification, or decommoditization and recommodification in some sense of basic services and sectors. So here I'm very interested more so in the UBI debate per se, especially, Silicon Valley discourse, whatever, into the universal basic services models, especially in combination with frameworks emerging like, donut economics, which I know is getting an interesting initiative in Amsterdam as well these days with Kate Wright. But yeah, there's many, issues and ideas behind this whole thing, but to have some sort of positive scenario where through like, our agency as activists, researchers, artists, designers, kind of to appeal or create demands or of the state to create spaces for participatory co-creation of economies, and essentially kind of using, integrated socio-ecological systems perspectives to design currencies, and thinking through also, kind of the potential pervasiveness of even these kinds of modes of accounting on things like, gift and solidarity economics. So just some visions like how it, some contributory value accounting based on socio-ecological systems work. Yeah.
I'll give a very short answer, and then I'll give the last word to Brad. I think what you've described are a lot of kind of bottom-up initiatives. However, at the same time, your question focuses on the state, and one of the problems there is we haven't really paid much attention to serious political organization. In fact, a lot of the discussions and initiatives that we discussed here were either market-based, grassroots, NGOs, name it, artists, small collectives, but never serious political organizations. And now that you are phrasing this question, we maybe are massively confronted with the fact that we lack, let's say, serious political organization. I'm not saying necessarily that we are not creating political parties, but okay, we don't have that, and unless we don't really work on those political organizations, it's going to be difficult for us. And we are using a lot of kind of intermediate levels in order to directly come in confrontation or in dialogue with that state. Okay, Brad, and then now it's yours, and we're wrapping up.
Okay, sure. I'll try and keep it pretty short. I mean, I love the fact that you kind of laid out this sort of tapestry of ideas and stuff, and actually, I mean, yeah, you're sort of channeling the. I think earlier on I was sort of saying these different responses people have in crises, and one of them is the sort of communitarian, solidarity-based, mutualistic, anarchisty approaches, right? And often the intuition in sort of anarchist thinking or left-leaning anarchist thinking, so you want to create these horizontal networks that are all federated together and they kind of all link up in this kind of organic dynamic mesh. And then in your mind, like, you start imagining these like solar punk structures with, like, you know, vines and, like, you know, community farms and all this stuff, right? And it's great. This is like the sort of the impulse behind a lot of communitarian initiatives. And of course, because a lot of these things are small, the impulse is to then imagine them all linked up, because that's how you make them big, right? Is to like link them all together. And a lot of what you call like post-capitalism, or the sort of like the intuitions behind that, is this kind of like nebulous feeling that if only you could like make all these things work together, some new society will emerge. And like, this is like a totally legitimate thing. And those names you mentioned there, peer-to-peer foundation, grassroots economics, EXA, Economic Space Agency, we know all these guys. This is like the community that specializes in all this kind of stuff, in the G-growth community. And actually, Geert, I was like kind of interested in this point about the serious political organizing, because I also spend time with the sort of like, you know, like labor activists, and who are often extremely intolerant of alternative economy initiatives. They're just like, what are you doing? Like, this is a waste of time. Like that you spend your time thinking about like a local currency or something. Like, go in the serious, like, you know, go form a political party, hit the instruments of state. And actually, the alternative economy movements, people who work as often avoid the serious political organizing because they think it's kind of conservative or doesn't really go far enough. And I think some of the most, I guess the sort of the key right now, in terms of stuff that would excite me, is to try and like find that zone which is politically, well, like economically radical but politically possible. Because it is possible in these sort of like, you know, utopian or kind of imaginations of alternative economies to end up in this zone which actually can never really be implemented, right? So you spend years discussing concepts around ecological economies, but like never can actually get it into the mainstream political realm. And I think that's the sort of I'm kind of going around in circles, but you get the point. But to find that point right now where actually there's an intersection between those. And I do think right now is one of the times, it is like, you know, it's one of the best times in decades to actually start thinking about how to advance some of these more radical ideas into the mainstream political debate. And that probably will take more serious engagement with the political system. So anyway, I support your impulse like 100%. And then the key question is now, how do you like actually bring that into fruition?
Okay, Brad, thanks a lot. A very interesting dialogue, and thanks everybody to attend to the video here. And the next time it's going to be live. But Janos, I give the word now to you.
Thanks. Thanks you all for the valuable contribution to this first session of the ML8 streaming series. I would like to thank particularly the staff of Axioma Institute, Marcela, Sonia, Nika, Jana, and Walter for the production of the event, and Jan Marin and the entire crew of Ćosić for their precious technical support. We will be with you again next week, always on Monday, always at 5 p.m. Central European Time, and always at this address, axioma.org/ML8. For the second streaming event, we have the writer and thinker Evgeny Morozov with a talk entitled Beyond Solutionism in a Post-COVID-19 World that will be introduced and moderated by the Slovenian independent investigative journalist Lenart Ćosić. Thank you for being with us today. See you next week.